I call this hearing of the Rules and Administration Committee to order. I'd like to thank Ranking Member Blunt, who's voting right now. I ran into him. He'll be back very, very soon. And our colleagues, our witnesses, for being here today for this very, very important hearing. And this is about something that we've been seeing all over the country, I sadly don't think it's going to be the last time that we're talking about it, and that is threats on our public servants who are working on the front line protecting our democracy. Our witnesses here today, and we thank them for coming to talk about this, Arizona Secretary of State Katie Hobbs, Republican Philadelphia City Commissioner Al Schmidt, Wade Henderson, the interim president and CEO of the Leadership Council on Conference on Civil and Human Rights, as well as Matt Masterson, who's right in front of us as well, former Election Assistance Commissioner member who is now a fellow at Stanford Internet Observatory. And then also we're going to hear remotely, I believe, from Kentucky Secretary of State Michael Adams, and I thank him for appearing as well. The freedom to vote is fundamental to all of our freedoms, and safeguarding the freedom not only requires protecting the right to cast a ballot, but also the right to have that vote counted. That right depends on election workers across the country, including volunteers who work to ensure that our elections are free and fair. In the last year, election officials and election workers in red, blue, and purple states have faced a barrage of threats and abusive conduct from those seeking to interfere with the certification of the 2020 election or overturn the results. I've heard about threats from officials in my own state, including threats targeting our own Secretary of State, Steve Simon, and from others across the country. These threats have persisted despite the last administration's Department of Homeland Security calling the 2020 election the most secure in American history. And they didn't stop after the 2020 election or after the violent insurrection on January 6th. Since then, multiple states have considered laws targeting election officials with removal, fines, and jail time for performing their duties in the same manner that made the 2020 election, with its record turnout in the middle of a public health crisis, actually so successful in terms of people voting. According to a survey of local election officials earlier this year, nearly 1 in 3 felt unsafe because of their job, and nearly 1 in 6 had received threats of violence. We should stop and remember that number again. 1 in 6 local election officials have reported experiencing threats of violence. There are no shortage of horrific examples from the last election. In Nevada, an election worker and veteran received calls telling her she was, quote, going to die, end quote. In Georgia, poll workers in 10 counties received bomb threats before the Senate runoff election. In Washington, an election official's home address was posted online along with crosshairs over her photo and the threat, quote, your days are numbered, end quote. These are not isolated incidents, and all 3 of the election administrators testifying today can attest to having their lives threatened. At the same time, election workers are facing increasing pressure in their job as states pass legislation threatening removal or fines for even accidental noncompliance with state election laws. In Iowa, the Secretary of State is now required to issue a fine of up to $10,000 anytime a county commissioner has a, quote, technical infraction, end quote. And in Georgia, the restrictive voting law enacted in March gives unchecked power to the state election board to remove local election officials. We heard about these partisan takeovers of elections at our field hearing in Atlanta from one election official who had been ousted by the state legislature after over a decade of service. Importantly, these threats have raised concerns about state and local government's ability to retain election officials and recruit workers to administer future elections. We are also seeing states taking actions that undermine public trust in our elections, including through sham audits like we saw in Arizona and that are happening right now in states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. In the face of these threats confronting our elections, it is up to us to take action to address this head-on. The Freedom to Vote Act, which I introduced with the members of the Voting Rights Working Group convened by Leader Schumer, which also included Senators Merkley, King, and Padilla, who are on this committee, as well as Senator Manchin and Senator Kaine and Senator Warnock. That bill would do exactly that. The legislation includes critical provisions like Senator Ossoff, who also serves on this committee, his Right to Vote Act, which would allow voters to challenge practices that interfere with their right to vote in court, including actions to empower state legislatures to determine the outcome of elections instead of voters. It includes Senator Warnock's Preventing Election Subversion Act to protect elected officials from being removed for partisan reasons and make it a federal crime to threaten election workers or volunteers. And it includes my Protecting Election Administration from Interference Act to create protections against interfering with counting ballots, canvassing, and certifying elections, as well as strengthen protections for election records. Protecting those on the front lines of our democracy should extend beyond partisanship, and that is why I'm so pleased that Senator Blunt and I jointly announced this hearing, and I appreciated the strong statement he made going into this hearing. I'm hopeful that this hearing will enable us to hear directly from our witnesses about threats that are striking at the foundation of our system of government, so we can work toward finding some common ground on how we can protect election administration and our election workers. With that, I turn it over to my friend and colleague, Ranking Member Blunt.
Well, thank you, Chair Klobuchar, and thank you for calling this important hearing. I want to thank our witnesses for joining us here today. I spent 20 years as either a local election official or the chief election official in our state as Secretary of State. I know the hard work that goes into running our elections. State and local officials are responsible for ensuring that our elections are run effectively, and I think do a great job of taking on the responsibility of being sure that people have confidence in what happens at the end of that election day. For more than 200 years, states have been responsible for elections, and state and local election officials work tirelessly, often managing multiple elections in a year, sometimes with different jurisdictions at the same day with jurisdictional boundaries that don't exactly meet, but it just throws another complication into the challenges that local election officials have. They deal with the logistics and that those elections bring, and I'm grateful to them for doing that. Our role in Congress is to support states in their administration of elections and give them the help they need to innovate and serve the needs of their citizens. This type of work can be done in a bipartisan manner, and historically that's exactly what Congress has done. After the election in 2000, Congress passed the Bipartisan Help America Vote Act. It was not called the Tell States and Local Governments How to Run Elections Act because it didn't do that, and frankly, didn't occur to members of Congress at the time that that's what the system called for. I think it's better when we work together. We've repeatedly worked on iterations of a bill that has been solely crafted in this Congress by our friends on the other side, but Senator Klobuchar and I try hard with this committee to do what we can to bring the election community together. We've heard from local election officials that they've been subject to increasing threats as they go about their jobs for the election for the American people. And while I anticipate we'll hear a lot from my colleagues about these threats, none of us want to see them happen. This is not an issue that just implicates just one party. In fact, when I used to do election training sessions, I would say there are two of you doing every job. And one of the reasons is so you can watch each other, but an even bigger reason is so you can protect each other by being sure you both take that job seriously and your obligation to the other person working alongside you just as seriously. Threats and attempts to harm election officials, poll workers, or voters should be investigated, and where appropriate, they should be prosecuted. We have a chance to lower the temperature of the rhetoric surrounding elections. Today, this hearing provides us with an opportunity to get back to the bipartisanship that has for so long defined this committee and, on these issues, the United States Senate. We can work together to learn about emerging threats to election administration. We can learn how states deal with threats, how they share information about threats with other states, law enforcement, and the federal government, and how, if possible, Congress can help states improve their ability to respond to threats of violence. This hearing provides us with an opportunity to hear about states' responses to cybersecurity threats, as we know states will continue to deal with those types of threats as well. I've heard from many election officials who would like increased and improved information sharing, including information sharing about threats of physical safety for election officials, poll workers, and voters. As states administer elections, access to more and better information will help ensure elections continue to run safely and smoothly. Supporting election officials by ensuring they have the best information that available to them can help instill confidence in their part of the process, and just as importantly, strong confidence in the results of our elections. Our election workers deserve to be safe and secure in their jobs. Voters deserve to be safe as they mark their ballots. As I've mentioned, this is a very important issue that deserves serious attention. I want to thank my colleagues who are participating today and our witnesses for being here today. I look forward to a productive discussion.
Very good. Thank you very much, Senator Blunt. And I also welcome Senator Merkley and Senator Hyde-Smith, who are here, as well as Senator King, who I see on the video screen. Our first witness today is Arizona Secretary of State Katie Hobbs. Secretary Hobbs has served as Arizona's 21st Secretary of State since 2019. She previously served in the Arizona State Senate, including as the minority leader and the Arizona in the Arizona State House. Earlier in her career, she worked as a social worker and focused on issues including domestic violence, behavioral health, and homelessness. She also worked for Sojourner Center, one of the largest domestic abuse centers in the country. Secretary Hobbs earned her bachelor's degree in social work from Northern Arizona University and her master's degree from Arizona State University. Our second witness is Philadelphia City Commissioner Al Schmidt. Commissioner Schmidt is serving his third term and has served on the commission since 2011. As city commissioner, he is one of three members and the only Republican on the city's bipartisan board of elections. Commissioner Schmidt began his career as a policy analyst for the Presidential Commission on Holocaust Assets and also worked as a senior analyst at the Government Accountability Office. He earned a BA from Allegheny College and a PhD in history from Brandeis University. Are we going to have Senator Blunt introducing the other two witnesses? Okay, thank you. Senator Blunt will be introducing, I wanted to make sure we didn't miss you, Mr. Masterson. Our third witness is Wade Henderson. Mr. Henderson is currently serving as the interim president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Mr. Henderson previously served as president of the Leadership Conference from 1996 to 2016, and he has held leadership roles with the NAACP and American Civil Liberties Union. He is the recipient of numerous awards and honors, including the Hubert Humphrey Award for Civil and Human Rights, something near and dear to my heart, Hubert Humphrey, and the U.S. State Department's Eleanor Roosevelt Rights Award. Mr. Henderson earned his bachelor's degree from Howard University and his law degree from Rutgers. I have these.
Glad to have Secretary of State Adams join us from Kentucky. He's been the Secretary of State since 2020. He's here virtually with us today, but glad he can be part of this hearing. Previously served on the State Board of Election in 2016 and served in that position until he was elected Secretary of State. In 2007, Secretary Adams began his private practice in election law, first as General Counsel to the Republican Governors Association. Previously, he held positions with Senator McConnell, Kentucky Governor Ernie Fletcher, and the Department of Justice in the Bush administration. He earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Louisville and his law degree from Harvard Law School. Matt Masterson, the second witness invited by us today, is currently a non-resident fellow with the Stanford Internet Observatory. From 2018 through 2020, he served as a senior cybersecurity advisor at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Before that, from 2014 to 2018, Mr. Masterson served on the Election Assistance Commission, including a period as its chairman. I'm sure many of my colleagues will remember him from appearances before our committee in both of those jobs. Early in his career, Mr. Masterson worked for the Ohio Secretary of State's office, where he helped oversee voting systems, certification, and efforts. Has a bachelor's degree from Miami University, his law degree from the University of Dayton School of Law, and we're glad to have both of those witnesses as well as the other three here with us today.
Very good. If the witnesses could please stand and raise their right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you give before the committee shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? All right, thank you. You can be seated, and we'll now proceed to your testimony, and we'll recognize each of you for a 5-minute statement. We will begin with Secretary Hobbs.
Thank you, Chairwoman Klobuchar, Ranking Member Blunt, and members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to be here today. Next week will mark 1 year since the 2020 general election. Unfortunately, in Arizona and in other states, some choose to believe that the 2020 election has still not ended. To be clear, President Joe Biden won Arizona in a free and fair election, which was conducted according to the letter of the law. In Arizona, there were at least 9 post-election legal challenges, and although every challenge failed, as the lawsuits mounted, so did the threats against me and other election officials. 2 weeks after the election, armed protesters gathered outside my home and chanted, "Katie, come out and play. We are watching you." I never expected that holding this office would result in far-right trolls threatening my children, threatening my husband's employment at a children's hospital, or calling my office saying I deserve to die and asking, "What is she wearing today?" so she'll be easy to get. These threats have continued against me and others, but what concerns me more is the near constant harassment faced by the public servants who administer our elections. Nearly every day, they are on the receiving end of abusive phone calls and emails. In Arizona, orange jumpsuits were mailed to county supervisors. Last November, as election workers tabulated ballots inside the Maricopa County Tabulation Center, armed protesters were a frequent presence outside. We're already seeing high turnover among election staff, and I fear that many more will reach a breaking point and decide that this line of public service is no longer worth it. In truth, Arizona has one of the best-run election systems in the country, with robust processes to ensure the integrity of the election. This includes observer access during tabulation, pre- and post-election logic and accuracy testing of machines, as well as post-election hand count audits. Arizona law also requires each county's Board of Supervisors to canvass the election and certify their results to my office. After these processes took place in November, I sat alongside Governor Doug Ducey, Attorney General Mark Brnovich, and Chief Justice Robert Brutinel to certify Arizona's 2020 election. Despite the bipartisan certification of the results, our state legislature decided to perform a partisan ballot review. This exercise performed by our state legislature was not an audit. The partisan ballot review in Arizona can best be described as a sham. The review was plagued by errors that are simply unacceptable to actual election professionals. The Arizona Senate hired a firm, Cyber Ninjas, with no meaningful election experience or knowledge, and they made up the rules as they went along. Millions in tax dollars were wasted funding the audit and replacing voting machines rendered unusable by the Cyber Ninjas. The same legislators who billed it as the most transparent audit in American history now potentially face contempt of court for failing to produce audit documents. This entire exercise was an effort to sow doubt in the 2020 election results and is being used to justify voting restrictions. From the outset of the ballot review, I said that Arizona would become the blueprint for those looking to undermine elections. And as other states now consider similar politically motivated reviews, I'm all too familiar with the problems that such reviews create. Audits must be based on established rules and procedures. They must protect voter data and must be free of partisan influence. The ballot review in Arizona failed at each of these things and should not be replicated elsewhere. Many have remarked that the aftermath of the 2020 election was a reminder of just how fragile American democracy truly is. But at every turn, Americans have stepped up to protect it. Election workers who counted ballots fairly and accurately to uphold the will of the people. Officials who certified free and fair elections despite threats of political retribution or worse. Judges who rejected dozens of bad faith partisan lawsuits. Capitol Police officers who stood their ground against insurrectionists. At every turn, the people who believe in American democracy have stepped up and protected it. One person in particular who spoke out against the big lie and efforts to undermine our democracy was Grant Woods, a former Republican attorney general from Arizona and an aide to Senator John McCain. He passed away suddenly this weekend, and I would be remiss if I didn't take the opportunity to acknowledge him and the way he stepped up to defend elections in Arizona and across the country. Now it's your turn. Continued inaction in the face of these threats to undermine our democracy will have long-term consequences for the future of our country. I support the Freedom to Vote Act, and I appreciate the committee for holding this hearing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State Hobbs. I didn't know that about Grant Woods. I'd met him before, and sorry for your loss, and thank you for mentioning that. Next up, we have Commissioner Schmidt.
Thank you for inviting me to testify today on this very important topic. I'm Philadelphia City Commissioner Al Schmidt. In Philadelphia, the commissioners oversee all election operations in the city, from voter registration to election certification. I was first elected to this position in 2011, re-elected in 2015, re-elected in 2019, and have overseen more than 24 elections in my nearly 10 years of service. I am a Republican, and I believe that counting votes in our democracy is a sacred responsibility. For doing my job, counting votes, I'd like to quickly share with you some of the messages sent to me and my family. Tell the truth, or your 3 kids will be fatally shot. Included our address, included my children's names, included a picture of our home. Cops can't help you. Heads on spikes, treasonous Schmidts. You betrayed your country. You lied. You're a traitor. Perhaps cuts and bullets will soon arrive at, provides my address, names my children, Rhino stole election, we steal lives. There are additional threats that my family asked me not to share today because they are so graphic and disturbing. I have 3 little kids. My youngest is 7 years old. No matter what our party affiliation, this is not okay. And let's be clear, this is domestic terrorism. The whole point is to terrorize, to intimidate, and to coerce, and to prevent our democracy from functioning as it should. In my case, this happened in the city where our democracy first began. And it's not just threats. These aren't empty promises. 2 men who drove up from Virginia were arrested outside of the Pennsylvania Convention Center, where our election operations were consolidated in the 2020 election to, quote, straighten things out and intercept an imaginary truckload of counterfeit ballots headed to the convention center. They're arrested with guns and ammunition and lockpick tools. And by the way, those 2 men were also arrested just across the street here on January 6th because of their activity on that day. They, like many others, were lied to and deceived and deranged by those lies. And for what? To discredit an election that wasn't even close. Unfortunately, my experience isn't unique. My colleagues and staff receive threats. Democratic and Republican election officials across the country have been subjected to similar threats or far worse. As a recent report by the Brennan Center and the Bipartisan Policy Center has detailed, nearly 1 in 5 election officials now list threats to their lives as a job-related concern. The threats rise in frequency and intensity each time election officials and bad faith political actors spread disinformation about the 2020 election. This creates a vicious cycle in which elected officials lie to their constituents, deceive constituents, believe those lies, and then demand that those same elected officials do something to fix a problem that never occurred. And then elected officials use those demands as an excuse to do something. And most often doing something means making voting less accessible and fuels more violent threats to election officials. This is a nationwide problem that demands a national response. Chairwoman Klobuchar, Ranking Member Blunt, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I know working across party lines to find common ground on any topic is challenging, let alone on election reform. But for the sake of our republic, I hope you can work together to protect election administrators and our democratic institutions.
Thank you so much, and I'm so sorry this happened to you and your family, and I'm also sorry for you, Secretary Hobbs. This is unbelievably disturbing testimony. Next up, we have Secretary Adams of Kentucky. I think you're with us remotely. Thank you.
Chairwoman, thank you. Chairwoman Klobuchar, Ranking Member Blunt, members of the committee, good afternoon. I'm Michael Adams, Kentucky's Secretary of State and Chief Election Official. I was elected in 2019, but I got my start in election policy at a little intern desk in your hearing room 22 years ago. It's an honor to be back here, albeit virtually. Today we discuss an unpleasant topic, but the news is not all bad. In Kentucky, voting has never been as accessible nor as secure as it has been in the 21 months of my term. Last year, 3 months after being sworn in, I asked our legislature to grant me, a Republican, and our Democratic governor joint emergency powers to alter election procedures as necessary to ensure public safety in the pandemic without sacrificing voter access or ballot integrity. We made absentee balloting more available and extended in-person voting well beyond the one election day Kentucky had from 1891 through 2019. The result was a primary election and a general election that each set records for turnout, yet no spike in COVID-19 cases deriving from the in-person voting. This approach proved so successful and so popular that our Republican-controlled legislature voted nearly unanimously to make most of these temporary changes permanent. Early voting, an absentee ballot request portal, drop boxes, a signature tier process, and more. All this good news, ironically, lends itself to a higher level of frustration by me, by our other election officials, by our legislators, about the unwillingness of certain quarters on both sides of the aisle to accept the reality that our election process is accessible and secure. In our current populist, anti-establishment political culture, part of this is organic, a reflexive refusal to believe anything somebody in the government says. This is not unique to elections, as we've seen with lagging vaccination rates. However, part of this is not organic, but rather is driven by political actors who perceive some benefit in misinforming voters. Addressing this should not be a partisan issue. because misinformation is not limited to one side. In Kentucky, we election officials were subject to a misinformation campaign that resulted in numerous threats of violence and other verbal abuse. The so-called All Eyes on Kentucky effort directed against us did not come from conservatives concerned about voter fraud. It came from progressives duped into believing that we were engaged in voter suppression. Worse, this misinformation effort was given oxygen by senior figures within the National Democratic Party. I remain grateful to our Democratic governor for defending our state and calling out these lies. I'm not here to take political shots, to engage in moral relativism, or to diminish the experiences of Secretary Hobbs or any other election official. To the contrary, I'm here to show that the problem is even wider. The first step in ensuring the safety of our election officials is to do no harm yourselves. Please keep your rhetoric factual and responsible. Misinformation is the most serious threat our election system faces because it is upstream of so many other problems we face. Safety of election officials, willingness of election officials, including volunteer poll workers, to serve, voter turnout, polarization, and ultimately, the accepted legitimacy of our democratic system. Election officials are at risk, but we are not unique in this. Public officials are at risk. Those of you serving our nation in the U.S. Capitol certainly don't need me to inform you of this. In Kentucky, our Democratic governor has received threats from some on the far right. Our Republican Attorney General has received threats from some on the far left. Even public health officials in our state have received threats. And my fear is that school board members will be next if they aren't already. This shows the problem is worse than we might think, yet also less susceptible to a simple solution in the form of yet another federal law. At its best, Congress plays a constructive role in election administration by providing funding, reliable, predictable funding to our states, chipping in a share of election costs alongside state and local election funding. These efforts have been bipartisan and for that reason, accepted across the political spectrum. I have no wish that you pass any particular election laws going forward, but if you do, I hope you will do so in a non-ideological, bipartisan fashion, rather than furthering the polarization that plagues our politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next up, Mr. Wade Henderson. Or well, go ahead, then I'll go to Mr. Masterson. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Klobuchar, Ranking Member Blunt, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm grateful for your work to make sure that every voter can safely and freely cast a ballot that counts. Since the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County versus Holder gutted the heart of the Voting Rights Act, we have seen a tidal wave of measures to restrict the vote. In just the last year, surrounding the 2020 presidential election, attempts to deny the franchise closely resembled the Jim Crow era in both intent and intensity. Some of the most troubling developments have been attacks on election officials and the election process itself. Make no mistake, this is race discrimination changing form and adapting to circumstances of today. It is no less egregious and no less perilous for our democracy. Today, I want to talk about how these threats to election administration are ultimately about denying people their freedom to vote. First, let's look at the astonishing rise in threats against election workers and their families. Election workers and administrators are absolutely essential to a successful democracy. No election official should live in fear. Yet, as you've heard today, Arizona Secretary of State Katie Hobbs, Commissioner Schmidt, and others have received death threats in connection with their jobs. A recent study by the Brennan Center, which has been cited, a Brennan Center for Justice, found that 1 in 3 election workers feel unsafe, and 1 in 5 listed threats to their lives as a job-related concern. It is simply unconscionable that after showing up during a pandemic to deliver democracy to voters, election officials and workers are now the target of vicious attacks. These threats have devastating consequences, not only for the people in danger, but for democracy itself. Growing concerns around the safety and integrity of election work will lead to an exodus of election staff, with a disastrous ripple effect across our democratic processes. For voters, that could mean longer wait times, closure of polling places, a rise in voter intimidation and harassment at the polls, and widespread loss of confidence in elections. Lawmakers must take immediate steps to keep the wheels of democracy turning safely for voters and election workers alike. Second, we must focus on the latest efforts to sabotage elections through sham election reviews. Whatever our color, background, or zip code, we believe that voters pick our leaders. Our leaders do not pick their voters. But in the wake of the 2020 election, some officials began pushing anti-voter reviews that are catastrophic to the integrity of our democracy. They also divert crucial time and taxpayer dollars from the issues that matter most to voters. President Trump's Department of Homeland Security called the 2020 election the most secure in our history. Nonetheless, officials launched a sham review in Arizona's largest and most diverse county that ultimately revealed a count closely matching the official results. This Arizona review has now formed the basis for others in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Florida. Why? Because despite pervasive barriers to the ballot, Black, brown, and Native voters in these states are turning out in the polls in historic numbers. Election review scams are blatant attempts to intimidate these voters and to discount their votes in the face of their emerging political power. Lastly, I want to acknowledge other equally sinister attempts to subvert democracy. In August, the Leadership Conference published more than 10 state reports that document pervasive patterns of racial discrimination in voting. As the reports note, since the 2020 election, states including Florida, Arizona, Georgia, and Texas have adopted sweeping anti-voter laws that make it harder to vote by mail, limit or prohibit ballot drop boxes, and force voters to navigate burdensome red tape to cast a vote that counts. Senators, I want to be clear. These years of overt and covert anti-voter tactics are taking their toll on voters of color. Communities trying to engage politically are forced to navigate tremendous barriers to the polls. But these unconscionable tactics are also causing great fear and disillusionment about even participating at all. And perhaps most destructive, these tactics push Americans to lose hope in democracy and to lose faith in the power of their vote. Time and again, voters have shown up for democracy. Now I implore this body to show up for voters before it's too late. Members of the Senate must swiftly pass the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and set a basic federal foundation for voting access. I look forward to working with all of you to enact reasonable protections to build a democracy that works for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next up, Mr. Masterson. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairwoman Klobuchar, Ranking Member Blunt, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the ongoing and pervasive threats targeting election officials, workers, and private sector employees who support elections. The 2020 election placed election officials at the center of national attention in a way not seen in decades, if ever. Record turnout and a smooth election day validated election officials' incredible work. Their reward for this professionalism and bravery? Months of threats against their lives and the lives of their family members. The perpetrators of these threats are fueled by online conspiracies that cast election officials as malicious actors bent on meddling in election results. Innocuous glitches and human errors have been stitched together to fit broad conspiratorial narratives as alternative explanations for election results. Recently, myself and a team of students at Stanford published an oral history of the 2020 election, where we interviewed folks like Commissioner Schmidt and Secretary Hobbs, and election officials from across the country in the political spectrum. Virtually all of those who we interviewed shared stories of calls, emails, social media posts threatening them, their staff, and their families. For instance, Secretary Barbara Sagaski of Nevada, a Republican, shared with us that she and her family and staff were targeted with death threats regularly and even had drones flown over her house. Or Tina Barton, a local Republican election official from Rochester Hills, Michigan, received death threats, including one that made clear that when she went out in public, she would find a knife at her throat. As the bipartisan Florida Supervisors of Elections recently wrote in a memo to their voters, quote, during and after the 2020 presidential election, the integrity of our democracy has been challenged by misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation that sows discord and undermines trust in America's electoral process. Many of us have been threatened by our fellow citizens who have been led astray by these deceptions. If additional protection is not provided to those who are threatened, many election officials may face the horrible choice of either continuing to receive threats for doing their jobs or leaving the profession. The field is already losing officials at an alarming pace. So how do we respond to these threats and best support election officials? First, we must fund elections consistently at the state, local, and federal level. Regular and consistent investment in our elections is needed, and a shared funding structure should be implemented in which all levels of government pay for their portion of each election. Second, we must ensure the physical security of election officials, offices, and staff across the country. The recent creation of the Election Threats Task Force at the Department of Justice is an important and encouraging step, but a lot more must be done. Publication and use of threat data from the DOJ Election Task Force should provide necessary data after each election regarding the scope and scale of threats against election officials and workers and the responses to those threats. Increased information sharing regarding those threats. In order to ensure comprehensive data is collected, analyzed, and shared, local and state law enforcement should be required to share activity directed against election officials and workers with federal law enforcement within their state. In return, federal law enforcement should regularly report to state and local officials regarding the activity in the jurisdiction with full transparency regarding any actions taken, including if investigations have been initiated. Penalties. Following the 2020 election, there have been few consequences for those who have threatened election officials. Congress and state legislatures should pass laws offering harsher penalties for threats or acts of violence against election officials, viewing them as a threat against our democracy. Privacy. Many threats, as we've heard, against election officials and staff directly target their homes and their families. More must be done to protect their private information from malicious actors. Finally, physical security and doxing training. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency should build on the work that they did on physical security in 2020 and offer training and guidance on physical security and doxing prevention measures, utilizing the protective security advisors who are present in the states across all 50 states and the territories. We must also continue to improve the cyber resilience of American elections. Securing this infrastructure goes hand in hand with protecting these officials. This starts by working with states to implement pre-certification audits of paper ballots, and then working with CISA on a voluntary basis, cybersecurity baselines to include things like multi-factor authentication, network segmentation, access controls, patch management, and moving election websites to .gov, as well as additional scalable proactive services from CISA to those state and local election officials. Our elections are imperfect. They are massive, messy, underfunded, and under-resourced. But they are accurate, secure, accessible, and fair because of the tireless work of state and local election officials. And the only response to the sustained attack on our democracy and against those who run it is a sustained investment in those working hard to protect it. I thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Just a factual question first. Do you all agree that threats against election workers increased during and after the 2020 election, violent threats? Does everyone agree?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
Mr. Adams?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Do you believe that makes it harder for states and local governments to recruit and retain election workers and volunteers?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Secretary Hobbs, can you expand on the extent that threats based on what you've seen and experienced as Arizona Secretary of State, do you agree that there should be federal action to address it?
Absolutely. As I shared in my testimony, there were armed protesters outside of my house. I had to have 24-hour security and install security features in my home. My son's phone number was doxed, and my husband's workplace, a children's hospital, faced calls with horrible accusations and urging that my husband be fired because of me. No one should have to face this kind of behavior because of their work as an election official. So yes, federal action is needed. There should be consistency across the country in terms of protection for election workers. Just as with many of the voter protections provided in the Freedom to Vote Act, it shouldn't matter what state you're in to determine the level of protections you're afforded. Furthermore, if it's for a federal election, for a federal office, then there absolutely should be federal protections.
Commissioner Schmidt, can you share with the committee more about your decision to speak up about the threats against you and your staff and your family?
Well, I wrestled with it a little bit on the front end because on the one hand, you don't want to acknowledge people who do something like this. You don't want to sort of scratch that itch. You don't want them to know that they got to you, to know that you read their text messages or their email messages. So that was, on the one hand, why I was at first hesitant to share all this. But on the other hand, it's important to know exactly who these people are and what they're trying to do. And obviously not just to me, to many others, and in many cases far worse than mine. So at the end of the day, I think it was a matter of being public about it outweighed my reluctance to, acknowledge that they were even doing something like this.
You've previously noted that, because of where you were located in a city, you had some law enforcement help, you had some legal support. Can you speak briefly to how that compares to experiences that might be faced by election workers in rural parts of your state or rural parts of the country? And sometimes they're more difficult situations, actually.
Yeah, I would say despite all of this, I was very fortunate to be in Philadelphia at the Pennsylvania Convention Center, surrounded by literally hundreds of police officers and Philadelphia sheriffs to keep us safe so that we could go about doing our job, which was to count votes while demonstrations were occurring right out front. Whenever I left the convention center, sheriffs went with me, made sure that people who came at me were sort of kept at bay, going back and forth to City Hall from the convention center. We also, I think I was fortunate that we had a whole phalanx of city solicitors at our disposal to fend off all the litigation and other things that we were going through as we were trying to do our job. Most counties in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania don't have that. They might have one part-time solicitor. They certainly don't have the access to resources that we had in Philadelphia. So, relatively compared to them, it's almost embarrassing to be the person sharing this with you today because I'm sure many of them were not as well protected as I was. At home, we installed a comprehensive home security system and made other investments to protect our home from people like this.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Henderson, could you just comment briefly on the importance of strong federal protections for election workers like those in the Freedom to Vote Act?
Yes, Madam Chair. As we've heard from both Secretary Hobbs and Commissioner Schmidt, the courage that they have demonstrated in carrying out their responsibilities should not become the standard by which election administrators are measured. How can we possibly expect individuals, regardless of party affiliation, to come to the American people's rescue by serving effectively in their job as an election administrator when they face death threats that go beyond the norm based on disinformation that continues to spew forth in ways that corrupt the integrity of our elections? Certainly, we think that the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act have protections that, indeed, election workers can benefit from. The fact that that legislation challenges the way in which election administrators carry out their responsibilities. That is to say, it protects them from the kind of interference that we are seeing. It protects them from being replaced by partisan individuals who have no desire to carry out a fair and free election, but instead to manipulate the outcome in ways that affect the partisan nature of the election. What we have before us now are individuals who exemplify the best in our election system. And the legislation, which is currently under consideration in the Senate, has a number of provisions that would address these subversion bills that are being enacted in various states, and notably, I should point out, in a number of swing states that will make a difference in future elections. So whether it's Arizona, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Texas, Georgia, we are seeing state legislators enact these provisions, and only by enacting the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act can we hope to address these issues.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn over to Senator Blunt, and then Senator Merkley will be chairing while I go and vote. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chair. For the three active election officials right now, Secretary Hobbs, Secretary Adams, and Commissioner Schmidt, I think everybody said it was harder to recruit and retain election workers now. What are you doing about that? And when are your next elections in your state, Secretary Hobbs?
We have jurisdictional elections going on right now, but most of those are by mail, so we're not having the same need to recruit as many poll workers as we will in the 2022 election. We're certainly going to continue our efforts at recruitment and hope that people will take part in this civic engagement, but it is absolutely a concern, and we're absolutely seeing turnover in our offices and local election offices as well.
So is your bigger concern the people that come and work polling places on election day, or the people that are permanently identified as part of the election process in your office or the local election official?
I think our concern really is the loss of that professional election administration and the drain, not just in Arizona, but across the country, of folks that do this work, and that they, as I said before, it's not worth it anymore for these not very high-paying jobs, and combined with the level of threat that they're experiencing at the moment.
Okay, and when you're talking about the not very high-paying jobs, you're talking about, in that case, the not very high-paying permanent jobs.
Government jobs, yes.
As opposed to not very high-paying election day jobs.
Right.
Right. Secretary Adams, welcome back to the room, even if it's virtually, that you were an intern in 22 years ago, but same question. What are you seeing happen? Have you had elections where you had to have significant numbers of people available to conduct elections that day since November of 2020? And if you have, what have you done about that? And in fact, I'm sure you have.
Well, fortunately, this year is an off year in Kentucky. We get 1 year off from elections every 4-year cycle. That's this year. We do have special elections for some vacant legislative seats starting actually later this week with early voting. So we've not really seen much of an impact in terms of professional election administrators, which is to say State Board of Election staff or my staff in the Secretary of State's office. We've not seen unusually large turnover with those folks. What we've seen, though, is a lot of turnover with our county clerks who are elected officials. We have 120 counties in Kentucky. They all elect their own chief election official at the county level. Mm-hmm. Last year, we had 2 clerks resign in the middle of their term. They had enough. They were exhausted. It wasn't because they were threatened or harassed. It was because the job was extremely hard last year, and they were just done. This year, there's about 15 or so of 120 clerks that have told me they plan to retire next year. I think the number will go bigger. That's an unusually large number of retirements. I think it's attributable more to exhaustion with the job. We've made voting much easier in Kentucky than it had been previously. Part of the price of that is it's a harder job now to run an election. So we have seen some retirements there. With respect to our poll workers, it takes 15,000 volunteer poll workers to run an election in Kentucky. I testified to our legislature right after I was elected in 2019, before COVID, that we had a crisis brewing with our poll workers because they typically are well into their 60s or 70s, and as they're increasingly unavailable, they're not being replaced by younger generations. I'm a Gen Xer. Gen X, unfortunately, has not stepped up in a volunteer fashion to be poll workers. So that's a big problem that we have. It's not due to threats or intimidation. It's just that we're losing poll workers, and we've got to find a way to inspire people to volunteer, and not just in the election sphere.
Commissioner Schmidt, what have you seen both with your permanent election day in and day out structure and any concerns about recruiting people to be at the polling places for election day?
Well, in Philadelphia, the 3 city commissioners who oversee elections, there are 2 from the majority party and 1 from the minority party. And I won't be running for re-election again in 2013. And a big concern of mine is that I'll either be replaced by someone who's elected who is intent on denying the integrity of the election, regardless of evidence, or on the other side, someone who will not be a sufficient check or balance to the Democratic majority on the Philadelphia Election Board. At the local level, it's been an ongoing problem with losing poll workers. Just as the Secretary just said, elections become increasingly complex. Our city and many counties in the Commonwealth acquired newer and better voting technology that is a lot more complicated, or at least it's a lot newer to those election board workers, in addition to the sort of strain that we talked about here. And our Commonwealth also just instituted mail-in ballot voting, which is an entirely new system of voting to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. We had absentee ballot voting before, but now that as well. So elections have become a lot more complex. You know, people say to me, as they say to I'm sure many who work in elections, like, what do you do the other 363 days of the year? Mm-hmm. And really what we're doing is working every day to make sure that election day runs smoothly, because there's no redos when it comes to elections. They have to be right, and they have to be right every time.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. We're going to now turn to Senator Angus King, who I believe is joining us electronically.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Glad to be with you. Secretary Adams, delighted to have you with us today. First, I want to commend you for your comments at the beginning, because part of the problem is we've converted political opponents into enemies, and everything is a war. And once we go down that road of the heated rhetoric, we really need to back off from that. I have sitting next to me a big chart of Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural. And that's where he said, "With malice toward none and charity for all." If anybody had any reason for malice, it was Lincoln at the end of the Civil War, but he didn't. And I commend you for that. Let me ask you a question. Is voter fraud a problem in Kentucky?
Well, I would maintain that it is not currently, and it has happened in the past. Typically, it's occurred in a specific sort of situation where there's a perfect storm in 3 ways. Number one, it happens at the local level. It's not occurring at a statewide level or at a congressional level. It's happening in a small town or a small county where only a few votes can potentially tip a race. Number two, it's generally for a job that involves patronage. In other words, there's some sort of reward for the winner in the ability to distribute funds or jobs or what have you. And then number three, it tends to occur in a place where there's poverty, where votes can be bought for a pretty small amount of money. That's where we typically see vote fraud. I'm certainly not going to wish it away. It does happen. It's something that we work very hard to prevent, and when it happens, to prosecute.
But I think what you said is very important, because what you said is consistent with everything I've read and heard about voter fraud across the country. And that is, it's isolated. It's not widespread, massive millions of votes. It's one person votes for a dead person or something, but it's very unusual in rare cases. And we're talking around the problem here. A lot of the conversation today has been about the danger and threats to election officials. The reason those threats are being made is that people are being told something that's untrue, that that A, there was massive fraud, and B, that election officials were in on the fraud. Mr. Matheson, couldn't a lot of this be alleviated if our leaders would simply tell the truth to their followers?
Thank you, Senator King. Certainly, our work at the Stanford Internet Observatory and the work I did at CISA was to push people to the trusted sources of information about the facts with elections, and that's your state and local election officials who have information about not only the security and integrity of the process, but the accessibility and how the system works. And so for us, one of the core recommendations that we have in combating the mis and disinformation around elections is really driving and elevating the voices of our state and local election officials, as is done here in this hearing, to share the facts about how elections are run in the states, the fact that across all 50 states, our elections are bipartisan, they're transparent, and they're professional. And so, yes.
Well, the problem that I see is that this idea of massive voter fraud has become a pretext for substantial changes to election law around the country in the name of ballot integrity, when indeed it's the classic definition of a solution in search of a problem, where you're making significant changes which will inevitably affect a significant number of people. Mr. Schmidt, what about my thought that one of the most important, there are not enough state troopers in the world to guard every election worker. So bearing that in mind, isn't the best solution for our leaders to tell the truth to their followers about the fact that 2020 and every election in recent history has been straightforward and honest, and try to wean people from this idea that there's widespread massive voter fraud?
Not only are there not enough state troopers in the world to protect every election official, but there certainly aren't to protect their families as well. I think you're absolutely right in terms of the root or core of the problem. And the solution normally to lies is to tell the truth, but that has only met with so much success. Typically, that would be the antidote, and I haven't seen that as be successful as I'd like it to. In addition, I think it's really about removing motivations for elected officials to lie about elections on the one hand, and also on the other hand to take seriously and successfully prosecute these sort of threats targeting elected officials, trying to intimidate them to either do one thing or not do another thing, to do their job.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Senator King, and now we'll turn to Senator Hyde-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and my question is for Secretary Adams. Mr. Secretary, in your testimony, you said that voting in Kentucky has never been as accessible or secure as it has since you took office 21 months ago. To echo the mantra of the Kentucky senator on this panel, our Republican leader, our goal should be to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. It sounds like you've been successful in achieving that in Kentucky, and I applaud you in that achievement. One of the key proposals you focused on has been to press the state legislature to strengthen Kentucky's voting laws and voter ID. Now, due to your efforts, I think that you've accomplished that to show Kentucky voters have to show a photo ID when casting their ballots, as well as in my state of Mississippi, requires photo ID to be shown at the polls. There's been a lot of debate in this committee about voter ID and about what sorts of ID states should be able to require. Secretary Adams, why do you think it is important to require a photo ID specifically?
Well, I think we need the same degree of security in our elections that we need in any other respect in our lives, cashing a paycheck, entering a government building, getting on a plane, and so forth. I think that's entirely reasonable. It's also important, I think, that these laws be written in a humane way, that they ensure that people have a path to get a photo ID for free. We budgeted several $100,000 in our bill last year to make sure that people had access to photo IDs. And when we had our election, fortunately, we implemented this even in a pandemic and did not have the predicted disenfranchisement that folks thought we might have. So part of this is just for the obvious reason, but the other reason to do this is to have credibility when you're trying to do what I've tried to do, which is make voting easier also. I found that the best way to do election policy is to be bipartisan and cross-ideological, to work with both sides. And then you give both sides something they're concerned about. Democrats tend to be very concerned about access, and rightly so. Republicans tend to be very concerned about security, and rightly so. And so the best of both worlds is to say yes to both.
So you feel like it has truly helped secure accurate voters or the elections in Kentucky? You think that this has been a step that actually did that?
Yeah, it's not a magic wand, to be sure. There's other things that we've done that I think added security as well. The absentee ballot request and tracking portal, we use that to verify a voter's identity, but also to more efficiently ensure access to an absentee ballot and also help the voter track the ballot herself from the comfort of her home, see where it is in the system. That holds us accountable. It's appropriate. We banned ballot harvesting. I asked for and got additional authority to get our voter rolls cleaned up. And these things all got Democratic votes in our legislature because they were paired with expanded access to the ballot. I think that's the best way with respect to Congress to make election policies, to do it in a bipartisan way.
And in your testimony, you spoke a little bit about the election reform bill enacted in Kentucky. I want to outline how impressive a bipartisan achievement that bill was. It passed the Kentucky House of Representatives only 3 days after introduction by an overwhelming vote of 93-4. It passed the Kentucky State Senate just a few weeks later by an overwhelming vote of 33-3. And it was signed into law by the Democratic governor a few weeks after that. I'm just hopeful that we can capture some of that Kentucky spirit here in the U.S. Senate and to learn to pursue legislation that can bring us together and achieve overwhelming support, just as you did in Kentucky. How has Kentucky been able to achieve such broad support for its election reforms when the issue has become so partisan in other states and on the federal level? How did Kentucky achieve that?
Well, some of it was the luck, I guess, of having to run an election in a pandemic. I approached our legislature and asked for emergency powers to be able to make changes to acclimate our system to that reality. I didn't feel comfortable asking that I have all of that power by myself. I was the new kid in town and a Republican, and we had a high-profile Senate race ongoing last year, so I asked that the Democratic governor be included. I had seen what had happened in other states where there was partisan warfare between branches of government, between Democrats and Republicans in other states, and it led to election breakdowns. And I didn't want that to happen in our state. I didn't know that that was going to set an example later for bipartisanship in legislation. I'm really grateful for that. So when Congress has been at its best, as with HAVA, folks have come together across party lines, and I hope that we're able to do that again.
Thank you so much, and my time is out. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Next up, Senator Merkley.
Well, Madam Chairman, if you'd stayed along a little longer, I could have called on myself.
There we are.
Thank you. It's good to have you back. And I wanted to ask you, Secretary Hobbs, some questions. The review of the ballots in Arizona, did they turn up cases of non-citizens being organized to vote?
No.
Did you have some form of vote by mail?
Yes.
I was very struck when, in a previous hearing of this committee, we heard from a senator that the strategy of voting by mail was a strategy to enable illegal immigrants to vote. Is there any sense that in Arizona you established vote by mail in order to allow illegal immigrants to vote?
Absolutely not. In Arizona, vote by mail was established by a Republican majority legislature decades ago, and it's enjoyed by at least 75% of our voters every election, and closer to 85% this last one.
Thank you. We also had before this committee Jocelyn Benson, the Secretary of State of Michigan, and so I asked her the question because of their vote by mail, if they had reviewed and they had done a search for that type of fraud, and she had, and she sent us a letter that laid out every step of the way how they ensure that it's citizens voting, and had found 0 cases there. As far as I'm aware, we have 0 cases in Oregon, and Oregon initiated vote by mail. We did have in Oregon, over the course of a decade in which 61 million ballots were cast, sustained cases of 38 cases of voter fraud. So I'm not saying it doesn't exist. The two main types of voter fraud were somebody filling out a ballot in one state, like in a primary or general election, then moving to another state and filling out a ballot in their new state. That's certainly not a coordinated criminal strategy to undermine the legitimacy of elections, I don't believe.
I would agree with you, and that's the same kind of instances that we're seeing in Arizona.
Okay. Well, that led me to my next question of what kind of problems you did find. Did you find ballots shipped in from China? Because I kept hearing in the news over months that this was a major problem in the Arizona elections.
There were no ballots shipped in from China or anywhere else.
Okay. What did you find for the fraud from this second audit, or this long extended audit?
Well, it wasn't an audit, and the procedures that they went through really were not procedures at all. Certainly not acceptable at any level by election professionals. They were on a fishing expedition to find problems. The problems that they came up with in their report were manufactured. In fact, the proper place for election challenges is in court. And as I mentioned in my opening, we had 9 such legal challenges in Arizona, and they all failed. There's simply no evidence of any of this widespread fraud that's continuing to be alleged in Arizona.
Yeah. So let me turn to Mr. Henderson. Mr. Henderson, we're hearing that fraud is continuing to be alleged in Arizona after basically none was found, according to the Secretary of State. So you had mentioned that one of the steps in this strategy is weaponizing the examination of ballots or the reviews of ballots to spread distrust in our election system. What is the purpose of this effort to undermine election systems when they're actually working well?
Thank you, Senator Merkley. It should be noted that in Arizona, which was, of course, the home of the first audit, it was quite clear that the Maricopa County focus, the largest and most diverse county in Arizona, was intended to demonstrate by way of the private company Cyber Ninjas that apparently fraudulent votes had been counted and determined the outcome of the election. Fortunately, the very thorough, not review itself, because the review wasn't thorough, but the examination of what occurred in Arizona has demonstrated clearly that no fraud existed. And yet that effort has spawned similar initiatives in states like Wisconsin and Texas and Pennsylvania. In Texas alone, the state was won by the previous president. And yet, notwithstanding that, there is a desire to determine whether fraudulent votes were cast, and certainly the use of a focus, as some have mentioned, you mentioned, on undocumented immigrants, the effort to focus on Latino voters, African American voters, Asian American voters, usually occurs based on the demographic changes that have taken place in those communities and the emergence of new sources of political power among communities of color. This effort to hold reviews, these sham reviews, is intended to intimidate those voters and to discourage them from coming out in future elections. We've seen that in state after state, and Texas is a good example where a previous investigation was conducted by the Department of Transportation, focusing on individuals who were previously legally resident, but had not yet become citizens, and somehow suggesting that that population had cast votes fraudulently. There was absolutely no evidence to that effect, and many of the voters who had previously been in that pool of legally admitted resident aliens went on to become U.S. citizens and should have been entitled to vote. The effort to intimidate them into not coming back at future elections has been consistent throughout states that have chosen to have these audits, and that's why we say they're intended to really disenfranchise future voters.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Thank you very much, Senator Merkley, and thanks for all your work in this area. Senator Haggerty is next.
Thank you, Chair Klobuchar. Secretary Adams, I'd like to turn my next questions to you. In your experience, Secretary Adams, do voters tend to have more confidence in elections when the rules are set by members of their community in accordance with local conditions and preferences, or when the rules for all 50 states are actually dictated in completely partisan fashion by Washington politicians and bureaucrats?
Well, I can't say that I have lived through that experience, but I can tell you that I believe that part of the reason we were able to produce this reform that got praised here in Washington and around the country is because we were allowed to, as a state, solve these problems for ourselves. One thing I've seen in polling is folks, I'm pleased to say, have confidence in me, but they have more confidence actually in their county clerk. And that doesn't surprise me because they know their county clerk. They go to church with them, they go to the grocery with them. The more decentralized our system is, I think, the likelier that these policies will be supported by the people who then utilize them. And they actually see people they know being the poll workers and being the county clerks.
That makes complete sense. Secretary Adams, numerous polls show that overwhelming majority of Americans support common sense election security measures like voter ID laws. Many states have enacted such laws. In your view, would federal legislation that nullifies popular state election security laws like voter ID increase or decrease election security?
Well, I think the thing that we absolutely must have for the system to work is public confidence in our elections. And I do think there are some things that have been debated in this chamber that would reduce the security of our process, but there's no question they would significantly impact voter confidence in our system. The reason I was able to get expanded access to the polls in my legislation is because I also had security measures to show folks that we were serious about that. So I think these things have to be paired together.
Yeah. Do you think federal legislation proposed by Democrats that requires unlimited ballot harvesting in every state would reduce election integrity and security, Secretary Adams?
I do, and I can tell you about a specific case in Kentucky before my term. We had a mayor of a small town go to federal prison. She engaged in a ballot harvesting scheme. Her control of public housing led to her ability to put under duress the residents of public housing and compel them to vote by absentee ballot under the supervision of her campaign volunteers, and then those folks delivered the ballots back. There was no state law against ballot harvesting at the time. There is now. There were federal charges ultimately brought, but that's the kind of stuff I don't want to see happen. And certainly in going into an election year with local elections on the ballot, as we have in Kentucky in 2022, again, that's where you typically see these sorts of attempts occur. So I would certainly oppose any federal effort to overturn our new law to ban ballot harvesting.
Let me turn to election administration itself, Secretary Adams. In your view, would enacting on a completely partisan basis, by the way, federal legislation proposed by Democrats that overrides state election laws and puts Washington politicians and bureaucrats in charge of elections in every state, would that constitute a threat to election administration in and of itself?
Well, potentially. I think it certainly would be a threat to public confidence. If there's just one version, one partisan or ideological version of election policy, and it's foisted at a national level upon all the states, I don't think it will be well received. I think people have confidence in me and their county clerks and their poll workers and their governor for that matter. And I think that folks tend to be in more contact with us. They see us as directly accountable and they tend to trust us more on these issues. And so I do think that federalism is a good thing. Diversity of our country is a good thing. And I think that federalism respects that diversity. And to be clear, I don't think Congress should tell California or Arizona or Utah or any state that does things differently from Kentucky how to run their elections either, even if they don't like the way those states do those things. I think that all states ought to have the right to make those decisions. That's what the Constitution, I believe, contemplates.
I'd like to turn just to a different topic. It's been raised already in these discussions today, and that has to do with the reprehensible notion of threats surrounding elections, particularly threats to election officials, which I condemn at any level. Secretary Adams, you've noted in your testimony that it's never been easier to vote in Kentucky. That's the case in Tennessee as well, where Secretary Trey Hargett has done an excellent job. And we've had record voter turnout in 2020, thanks to his great leadership there. Yet you noted that you and your fellow Kentucky election officials actually received threats of violence in 2020, resulting from a misinformation campaign by a left-wing group that was egged on by national Democrats. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that unfortunate episode?
Sure. I'm not trying to target anybody or make any hay here. I just want to note that this is unfortunately not limited to one side of the aisle. In this case, unfortunately, there was a misinformation campaign that alleged that Kentucky was engaged in vote suppression, that it was some sort of intentional act by Republicans, namely me, to keep folks from voting, specifically African Americans from voting. It was really reprehensible. I'd say the number one person who helped us push back on that was our Democratic governor. As far as I'm concerned, it was one of his finest hours in his job as governor, is having the courage to stand up to the national media and out-of-state groups and call them on it and say this is false, that we actually have made it easier to vote than we ever had in Kentucky before. And in fact, we had the highest turnout we'd ever had in a primary election in a pandemic last year. Unfortunately, my office got thousands of abusive calls. To be clear, very few of them actually were actual threats, but a lot of harassment, a lot of verbal abuse of my staff, of the State Board of Elections staff. And this had two problems. One, the obvious, it's a horrible way to treat people. The other problem is, unfortunately, our phones were so logged with those that we believe that some Kentuckians who are calling to get information about how to vote an absentee ballot or where to go vote on election day weren't able to get through. So there's a real suppression angle to this as well.
Well, thank you for sharing that experience. It's regrettable on both fronts. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Next up, Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Colleagues, as most of you know, before I joined the Senate, I served as California's Chief Elections Officer for 6 years. And in that time, I recall proudly working with so many local election administrators up and down the state of California, as well as with my colleagues from states around the country, with the shared objective of making sure our elections were as safe, as secure, and as accessible as possible. In California, I believe we've succeeded in meeting that goal, and that is in no small part due to the hard work, dedication, and absolute professionalism of our local elections workers as well. These dedicated Americans are indispensable to the strength of our democracy. And it's because of that experience that it's been so deeply and personally troubling for me to hear story after story of election workers who now fear simply going to work, who are afraid that their nonpartisan work to help Americans exercise their right to vote and that their votes be fairly counted will make them the subject of threats of violence or worse. Election workers deserve better, and this Congress owes them better. And I hope that we, working together, can deliver that. Question for Ms. Hobbs, Secretary Hobbs. Beyond the recruitment of qualified full-time election workers, as we know, successful elections also rely on the army of temporary workers, poll workers by another name, to help staff the polls, to guide voters and perform day of election tasks like checking voters in, checking registration status, providing ballots, etc. Are you concerned that these ongoing threats to temporary election workers as well may also affect the administration of elections, including causing so many to choose to not volunteer or be reluctant to volunteer?
That's certainly a concern we have in Arizona. People stepped up in 2020 to fulfill this role in record numbers, and we're going to continue to try those recruitment efforts. And I hope that people will be engaged in that way. But I think that what folks have seen in the aftermath of the 2020 election is certainly going to put a chilling effect on that.
Thank you. And I think on a related front, we know that the presidential election of 2020 was a fair election, period. Joseph Biden was elected president of the United States, period. Donald Trump lost, period. Those are three factual statements. But even today, more than 9 months after President Biden was sworn in, there are still many in the Republican Party who are unwilling to acknowledge these basic facts. Instead, a right-wing ecosystem of misinformation and disinformation continues to perpetuate the big lie that the election was stolen. And so many Republicans refuse to speak up against it. This question is for Mr. Masterson. Mr. Masterson, what's the long-term consequence of these types of misinformation and disinformation campaigns, including how they relate to the security of future elections or voter confidence in elections?
Yeah, thank you, Senator Padilla. It's good to see you. The long-term consequences start with the erosion of trust and doubt and deception around our democratic institutions. The reality is that if our voters do not trust or believe in the results of our elections, our democracy is unhealthy and struggling to succeed. And the reality is that has implications, as we've talked about today, for the security of those who work in elections. It has implications for America on the national stage and the health of our ability to work with and support emerging democracies across the world. And it impacts us civically in all kinds of ways where truth and facts, not just around our democracy, but around any area of life, begin to fall by the wayside. And we've seen that certainly around COVID and the COVID vaccine as our information ecosystem continues to suffer.
Yeah, and last year's census count as well, as we recall experiencing. Madam Chair, I want to have the opportunity to finish my next question because this is the former Secretary of State in me shining through. We know that professional post-election audits based on proven standards and methodologies are an important tool for ensuring the accuracy and the integrity of election results while building voter confidence. I know such audits are a standard part of the election certification process, not just in California, but in states across the country. But these audits stand in stark contrast to the type of sham audit that was called for this year by the Republican state legislature in Arizona and is being considered by the Republican state legislature in Pennsylvania. So Secretary Hobbs and Commissioner Schmidt, can you describe how these Republican-driven sham audits, my words, not yours, differ technically from the professional standard-driven audits that are required in many jurisdictions, and how they too might impact voter confidence?
Senator Padilla, I don't know that there's enough time left in the day to do that. I will just say that in Arizona, the results were canvassed, certified, litigated, and legitimately audited according to the law. And what we saw in the sham audit was absolutely not a real audit. It detracted from transparent. There was no transparency. There were lapses in security. Every other professional auditing standard that you would see in place was just not there, and overseen by people with an entirely partisan agenda.
Thank you. Mr. Schmidt.
As a former senior auditor at GAO, I believe strongly in the importance of audits when they're legitimate and when they're real and when they're carried out by qualified people who know something about auditing and something about elections. That is not what we've seen to date. In Pennsylvania, every county in the Commonwealth conducts an audit after each election. In most counties, including ours, we conduct a secondary audit that's even more comprehensive on top of that. And the nexus between your question, the audits, or the so-called audits, and the threat issue are, I know in my experience and many others, the threats died down after Election Day, after the new president was sworn in. Now that the legislature's talking about instituting some sort of a bogus audit in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, they return. So this level of activity rises and falls, it spikes and decreases whenever there's sort of this comprehensive misinformation and disinformation effort, both around election time and now around audits as well.
Thank you both, and let alone, from what I understand in Arizona, what Otherwise, it would be unauthorized access to the actual voting systems themselves and what that portends for future elections. So, Secretary Hobbs, as you said, we don't have enough time in the day. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Padilla. Next up, Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our panel. I appreciate your presence here and your answers. Secretary Hobbs, nice to see you again. Secretary Hobbs, this question is for you. One of the many destructive effects of the lies and conspiracy theories fabricated by the former president and his attorneys to discredit the outcome of the 2020 election was the dramatic increase in threats of violence, attempts to intimidate election officials at all levels. There was a famous press conference held by a man named Gabriel Sterling, the chief operations officer in the Office of the Secretary of State in Georgia, a Republican and a Republican appointee, in which he urged the then sitting and defeated outgoing president to cease the lies because people's lives were at risk. And Georgia has really been at the epicenter of this trend. We've seen, as I said, election officials at all levels, from the Republican Secretary of State and his family all the way to Good Samaritan, nonpartisan volunteers at polling places, subject to abuse, harassment, and threats. We saw threats against polling places themselves. I've offered legislation to strengthen federal law protecting election officials. I would like you to comment, based upon your experience as the Secretary of State, how, in addition to the fear and the harm done by threats of violence themselves, how this impacts election administration and really is an assault on voting rights.
I think what's been much more ongoing and constant than the threats themselves are the level of harassment that's coming in to election offices, to our office for sure, not just the elections division, but other divisions of our office, keeping people from doing their jobs, and then election offices across the state, as the commissioner mentioned, when there's something, things seem to die down, and then there's heightened awareness again because there's a sham audit being proposed or whatever, then things level up again. And for my office, it's been nearly constant. And so it's been really, it's people that go to their jobs as public servants every day are exposed to this, and it's wearing them down. And so it's not just the threats, it's this constant harassment. Certainly some level of federal protection against the threats would be helpful, but there's just, I cannot describe how constant it is and how draining it is on people that are having to answer those phones or those emails or check those social media, and it's taking away from their ability to do their jobs.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mr. Henderson, one of the most concerning aspects of SB 202, the election law that was enacted in Georgia, is that it empowers partisan officials at the state level to take over, reconstitute, and perform the functions of local election boards at the county level. This could empower these partisan state officials to make decisions about polling places, about polling place locations, which can often change at the last moment, about processes that should be free of partisan interference and under local control, perhaps even decisions about ballot disqualification or results certification. Can you please comment on how such laws threaten the impartial and fair administration of elections?
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. I should note before I answer that Georgia is also the state that has chosen to limit voters' access to water and food while they're standing in often incredibly long lines that result from having closed polling places that would otherwise have been used during an election. We know that housing discrimination still exists in states around the country, and often polling places are set up in a way that particularly caters to a community of interest. And so often polling places that are closed would otherwise serve Black communities, brown communities. It's a huge problem. The fact that you and Senator Warnock have introduced legislation that would seek to limit the ability of state boards of election to interfere at the local level, to remove individuals who would otherwise and have served in a nonpartisan way for years, but would now inject a level of partisanship in their responsibilities, is something that for us is a huge problem. That's why we support the inclusion of the effort to protect against election subversion in the Freedom to Vote Act. This does have a real impact on individuals' willingness to trust the election, to feel that their votes will be protected, and even to turn out in future elections, which is really the purpose of many of these subversive laws. So we think it's a huge problem, and we know that some of these issues, of course, existed because of the 2020 election, where the big lie and the emergence of misinformation and disinformation have certainly corrupted the integrity of the elections in the way some view that. However, as had been noted at the outset in questions that had been posed to the panel, truth is an antidote to much of this. And if we were able to ensure that previously elected officials would speak truthfully about the outcome of the election, that would help us certainly protect against this kind of corrosive effect. In the absence of that, we need new federal protections that ensure that elections will be administered fairly in a nonpartisan way that respects and protects the interests of the actual voters themselves.
Thank you, Mr. Henderson. Briefly, I'm already over time here, Madam Chair, I recognize that, but I would note that's of particular concern, these election subversion measures, where, as we saw in the most recent election, the president was putting pressure on the governor of Georgia, the Secretary of State of Georgia, and the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia to overturn the election results. Thank you for your testimony, and I would note as well that I've introduced the Voters Access to Water Act to prevent localities and states from banning the provision of hydration to voters who are standing in line by nonpartisan Good Samaritan volunteers, and I thank Chair Klobuchar for including that bill in the latest draft of the Freedom to Vote Act, and I yield.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your good work. We're going to have a second round. People liked your interesting exchanges so much. We've had several requests, so I'm just going to ask a few questions here. Secretary Hobbs, you mentioned this in just recent answer you gave, but could you give a little more detail about harassment directed at your office, how it has impacted public servants who are not even responsible for elections, like those who assist with registering businesses or notarizing documents?
Yes, absolutely. The Business Services Division, Library Division, and even Address Confidentiality Program have calls to their lines or emails sent to them with harassing and threatening language. And as I mentioned, this has been near constant in Arizona since the election almost a year ago. There was a staff member in Business Services who took a call. It was threatening in nature, and this is not her job. She's not trained in threat assessment, but she kept this caller on the phone to get as much information as possible to be able to report this to law enforcement, and continued to allow this abusive behavior so that, because she was afraid if she didn't, that somebody was going to get hurt. And this was really traumatic for her, and, impacted her work for the rest of the day, but also keeping the caller on the phone kept her from doing her normal job. This is a division where the most common tasks in terms of what that division does take around 4 to 6 weeks in turnaround time. So this is not helping at all. It's bad for our constituents. And we've also delayed the opening of our Capitol Museum, that's under my purview as well, until we could arrange security because of what happened here on January 6th. And I wasn't willing to put our staff in harm's way when people who were still upset about the election and still directing their anger towards my office could utilize the avenue as well.
Very good. Thank you. Mr. Masterson, we know that misinformation on social media platforms like Facebook is widespread, and there's been bipartisan pushback on this right now, whether it is the work that today we had a second hearing actually on this in the Commerce Committee with Senator Blumenthal and Senator Blackburn on other platforms, specifically Snap and YouTube, as well as TikTok. But We now know that, in the new trove of documents recently came out, that Facebook deliberately turned off election misinformation safeguards right after the election. They were worried these safeguards were slowing the growth of the platform. Can you briefly explain the severity of the problem of election misinformation spread through social media? And do you agree that this has been part of the problem with threats?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Absolutely, this is one of the large challenges. Following the 2020 election, the Stanford Internet Observatory released a report on mis and disinformation targeting the 2020 election that looked at exactly this challenge and made a number of recommendations. The report highlighted the fact that individual platforms suffered from the challenge for consistent moderation of content around election and election information and promotion of correct or factual election information, again, highlighting the voices of state and local election officials, and also the cross-platform challenges that, even if action was taken by one platform, a tweet would show up again, maybe in a YouTube video or posted on Instagram somewhere. And there's a number of steps that could be taken. And the first that we recommend is transparency around the data, the interactions with this type of content. That the platforms can offer a lot more insight to researchers, to Congress, and nonprofits around the type of interaction. The second is consistent enforcement, having your policies up on your platforms and consistently enforcing the rules around that in a transparent way that folks can understand. Finally, as we prepare for 2022, that continued need to highlight the voices of state and local election officials. For instance, search engines, Google, could ensure that when someone searches for information on election information, the first thing to come up is the Secretary of State or local election website, as opposed to a trove of mis or disinformation around the election. I know many of the platforms and worked with many of them throughout 2020 to prepare. There was a lot of steps taken, but there's a lot more that could be done around transparency and support to state and local election officials to combat what is undoubtedly coming in 2022 and 2024.
And even beyond election misinformation, it's been just coming out more and more. I was seeing today the information that Facebook they changed their algorithms in 2017, I believe, so that anger or any kind of emoji was worth 5 times more in spread of information than a like. I just want you to think about that. So if you put some content out, Secretary of State, whatever, about elections or you put some content out about anything that's just kind of factual, you might get a like, people agree with you. Maybe I put one out that Senator Blunt and I did a bill together, we did this, we did that. You put something out that makes people angry, they're going to spread it 5 times more. I mean, that's a fact. If you can get people to do that anger thing, the anger emoji, then you're in for 5 times more the spread. So I just want all of you to think about that in terms of, you may have disagreements about, what misinformation is, what it isn't, but that polarization really on both sides, that principle, when you have this dominant platform that's doing that can change literally dynamics in how people relate to each other, which I think feeds into a lot of what we're seeing. I don't know, Mr. Henderson, if you wanted to comment on that.
Madam Chair, thank you so much, and I couldn't agree more with your observation. You're absolutely right. This disinformation, misinformation campaign has certainly undercut public willingness and acceptance of the election results as we know them to be. That is a huge problem. But I also want to point out that in some minority communities, many of the difficulties that we're talking about today with the attacks on election administrators are built on top of efforts that have already taken place in their states because of the elimination of the pre-clearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act based on the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County versus Holder. Just 2 examples of that point. In North Carolina, immediately after the Shelby County decision was handed down, a monster anti-voter bill was enacted into law that the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, in overturning it, announced that it was carried out with almost surgical precision to impact black voters. We see the same thing in places like Texas. My colleagues at the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund brought a lawsuit involving the city of Pasadena, Texas, that immediately after the Shelby County decision decided to completely remake its election procedures for the local government. It moved from a city with 8 local seats in the city election to a group of 6 with 2 at-large seats, with the intent of disenfranchising, or the effect of disenfranchising, Latino voters. Those kinds of problems abound in states like Alabama and Florida.
Thank you.
So that's a huge problem. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks for highlighting that. Senator King, a guy that tries to minimize anger on his social media posts in favor of constructive comments. Turn it over to Senator King and then Senator Merkley. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I hope I can remain constructive. First, I want to be clear, as one of the authors and sponsors of the Right to Vote Act that we worked on over the summer, it is entirely within the authority of Congress. Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution does, in fact, begin by saying legislature shall enact voting regulations. But then there's a semicolon in the word but, and it goes on to say Congress may by law alter or amend such regulations. So let's get rid of this idea that there is no role for Congress or the federal government in election laws. And of course, the 15th Amendment and going into the Voting Rights Act of 1965 are examples of that. So I think that's important. What we're trying to do, what I was trying to do in working on this bill, is not take over state election laws. I'm a former governor. I'm a big believer in states' rights. We're trying to set a floor, a national floor, for protecting the right to vote and protecting the integrity of the voting system, and to be sure that there aren't efforts in particular states to disenfranchise citizens. But it's not nobody wants to take over and run the election system of any of our states, but we think that it's very similar to what we do in the area of the environment. We have basic national standards on the environment, and then states set their own standards within that context. The second thing is, I think the testimony of Mr. Adams, Secretary Adams today, may be very important, because what he said was that he and working with the Democratic governor in Kentucky, a bipartisan election bill that reflected the views of both parties, and it passed by the legislature by a huge majority. That's exactly what we ought to do here. I heard my Republican colleagues, Senator Hyde-Smith and Senator from Bill Haggerty from Tennessee, talk about the Democrat bill. As far as I'm concerned, we've put a proposal out there. And if the Republicans are willing and want to come forward with proposals of their own, maybe involving election integrity that they think are important, or maybe involving anti-voter suppression, I don't know. But we've heard nothing but silence since our bill was put out into the public realm in early September. So I want to make it clear here and now on the record that I, for one, would be very willing and able to enter into constructive discussions with my Republican colleagues on what they would like in the bill. I'm tired of hearing it referred to as a Democrat-only bill. It's a Democrat-only proposal, but now is the time for negotiations. And now is the time for Republicans to come forward and say, okay, here's the way we think we should do it. And I think I'm speaking for my colleagues in the Democratic caucus. I, of course, have been independent, but I think this is a time when we ought to try to come together as two parties and work on a bipartisan proposal to deal with the issue of voter suppression. And indeed, if there are questions of voter integrity that need to be dealt with that ought to be part of this package, let's bring them forward and have those discussions. So, you can't clap with one hand. We need both sides to come to the table. And I think the example of what happened in Kentucky, what Secretary Adams has testified to today, is is a terrific example for us to follow. And I, for one, am ready to follow that example. So I address my comments to Chairman Blunt or to Vice Chairman Blunt and to his Republican colleagues. If there are issues on elections that you're concerned about, or if there are provisions of the bill that we've come forward with that you're concerned about, bring them forward to us and let's try to work something out. And the American people, it would be a great thing for the American people to see Congress working in a bipartisan way to deal with elections, to try to de-escalate the conflict to some extent and get us to a place where we're able to come to some reasonable consensus that will protect access, but also protect the integrity of the ballot. So that's what I wanted to add to the conversation, Madam Chair. And I hope you'll second me and say that you yourself, as one of the authors of the Right to Vote Act, would also be willing and anxious to enter into these discussions should our colleagues on the other side of the aisle be willing to make their own proposals. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Of course, we're always open to that. It's just been very difficult because time's ticking by here. We worked very hard on the bill, and we're proud that Senator Manchin has his name on it and that we've gotten our caucus behind it. And in this very room, we made a number of changes to the bill to make it easier for rural areas to comply. And through the months, with Senator Merkley's help as well, made several other changes. And the whole idea is just to simply guarantee people the right to vote in a way that's safe and a way that will limit some of the horrible aftermath that we saw in this last election and other places in terms of suits that shouldn't have been brought and in terms of people now questioning the very democracy on which the ground that we stand on is founded. So that's the idea. We think you should make it easier to vote. And in the past, this has been bipartisan, as Senator King has so beautifully pointed out many times, including, as Mr. Henderson knows, the Voting Rights Act years back was always a very bipartisan endeavor. So it's been disappointing, but that doesn't mean that we're going to back down from trying to get some kind of agreement or, most importantly, getting something passed. With that, I turn it over to you, Senator Merkley.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And President Henderson, when I asked about the motivation for folks spreading distrust in the election system, you noted that it was to intimidate voters and decrease turnout. But from your previous comments, I'm assuming you would probably also agree that the goal is to justify election laws that under a facade of election security that are actually about blocking targeted groups from voting. Is that a fair way for me to put it?
Absolutely, Senator Merkley. I agree with that completely.
Thank you. I was thinking about how historians look at an 80-year period in which the only thing that was blocked by extended debate in the filibuster were laws to protect the voting rights and political power of Black Americans for 80 years. But the point that historians make is it reached a point where they couldn't talk about stopping political power for Black Americans, so they had to talk about freedom of speech on the floor of the Senate, extended debate, and that was the cover story. First Amendment was the cover story for blocking political power for Black Americans. Is the argument about, or the discussion of election fraud the cover story today for blocking the political power of Black Americans and other citizens from minority communities?
I think your analogy, Senator Merkley, is absolutely on point. I think the argument that we are now dealing with a climate of fraud and insecurity about our elections, which is based, again, on the big lie, based on information that has been refuted time and again in a bipartisan way, not just by Democrats, but by the previous president's Department of Homeland Security, saying that it's the most secure election we've had. That kind of information is ignored in favor of the disinformation, misinformation, much of it found on Facebook and other social platforms, but of course reinforced by statements of the previous president that somehow he lost the election through fraud. And that is used to justify harsh new legislation that has the effect of blocking Black, Brown, Native voters, Asian American voters from participating even though those are the voters where we see the largest level of demographic growth in communities that would or rather provide voters at the polls. And so I agree with you completely.
Thank you. Secretary Hobbs, so our former president seemed to really hate vote by mail. And you told me you have vote by mail in your state and that it's fraud-free. Why do you think that former President Trump hated vote by mail so much?
I'm under oath, so I don't know that I should speculate on the former president's thought process. But I mean, the fact is that it makes it easier for people to exercise their freedom to vote. And what we saw when people showed up in historic numbers in an election that had multiple challenges was that they made their voices heard, and it didn't go his way. And so it seemed like, from my perspective, that what he was trying to do was sow doubt in the process and make it harder for states who didn't already have robust voting by mail to want to implement it.
Okay, I'm going to put forward a theory, and then I'm going to ask you if you think it holds water. And my theory is this, that it's very easy to manipulate the vote on election day. And by that, I mean you decrease the number of precincts and communities you don't want to turn out. You decrease the number of election officials at those polling places, so there's longer wait times. And you can put out, people, probably not the election officials, but others can put out misinformation about the location of the polling places. The election officials can change the polling places from 2 years earlier. Even information's been put out at times that says, oh, we're so sorry you missed the vote last week. So people think they missed the votes when the vote is actually the upcoming Tuesday. So there's many ways to decrease turnout on targeted areas on election day. And vote by mail is an antidote to all of that. There's no way. So if we want to talk about fraud, shouldn't we talk a lot about the fraud conducted on election day? And we don't really. And I want to give you an example. Georgia Public Broadcasting said that after 7 p.m. in 90% non-white polling places, the wait time was 51 minutes, and in 90% white polling places, the time was 6 minutes. Huge differential by perhaps I don't know that it was a deliberate strategy, but quite possibly a deliberate strategy. It's certainly possible it was deliberate. And then the analysis went on to note that there's rules in Georgia to make the polling places fair in terms of one polling place with a cap of 2,000 voters per polling place, but it's not enforced. And then I found another analysis said that other states have protections that are not enforced. My point here is that when I think about the 1 out of 1.6 million votes cast in Oregon that has been found to be election fraud, and across the country similar rates, aren't we facing really a lot of election day fraud where strategies to make it hard for some people to vote in their community as opposed to other communities? Is that a fair thing in your observation across the country?
I'm not clear if you're characterizing limiting access to voting on election day as is that what you're characterizing as
yes.
fraud? Okay, yes. I would agree that the less access we provide to voters, whether it's limiting voting to 1 day or otherwise limiting it, the less people are going to show up to vote, the harder it's going to be to do that.
When our committee went down to Georgia, Senator Klobuchar and I listened to stories about people waiting, I think 5 hours was one testimony. And then you think about, now it's against the law to pass out water. Or if you have to go to the bathroom, you lose your place in line. I mean, that's really the type of fraud I'm talking about, and that has a huge impact. Mr. Henderson, President Henderson, in your previous work with the ACLU and your current work with the Leadership Conference, has there been a systematic study of election day fraud in terms of kind of stealing the right to vote through the manipulation of polling places and polling information?
Senator Merkley, certainly the organizations that I've been affiliated with have studied Election Day fraud in that context. Now, I don't know whether they have prepared a specific report. The Leadership Conference has not. But I think your point, which is that there is a history of misinformation on Election Day that is intended to dissuade or disenfranchise minority voters from turning out at the polls. For example, the note that an election day is actually the following Thursday as opposed to the Tuesday on which an election is held, or information that says the polling place that you previously used has been closed, but you weren't notified to the extent that that has occurred. That kind of information predates these attacks on election officials, and as pernicious as the attack on election officials is, it does not operate in isolation. These other provisions which you have talked about, the kind of election day fraud that is directed at particular groups of voters with the expectation that they will not cast ballots on that day, has existed for some time, which is why I referred to many of these changes as being done in the spirit of Jim Crow laws that existed prior to the adoption of the Voting Rights Act.
So I'll just close with the notion that I'd love for ACLU or other organizations to study Election Day fraud, because I think it's very relevant. And it's relevant to why vote by mail and early voting are so important, because they take away the ability to conduct such fraud. I think far more Americans, millions of Americans, are affected by those long lines, or intimidation at a polling place, or misinformation about where a polling place is, or locating it in a place with no parking. There's many strategies, many forms of Election Day strategies. Listen, I want to thank you all for your service to our nation in the election system. It's absolutely essential that for a democratic republic to function well, the foundation has to function well, and the foundation is integrity in elections and trust in that integrity. And we have a lot of work to do, and I thank you very much for being engaged in that work.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Senator Merkley. And I want to thank Ranking Member Blunt. He had to go to another meeting, but I want to thank him for helping us put together this hearing. I want to thank all the witnesses and members of the committee for this informative hearing. I also want to thank you for your courage, those of you who have received threats. Most likely everyone who is a witness has received a threat one way or another, as we all know up on this side of the dais. And I want to thank you for being willing to come forward. Commissioner Schmidt, your testimony about receiving a message saying tell the truth or your 3 kids will be fatally shot, I don't think anyone's going to forget that testimony as we look to what we need to do to fix this situation. The names of your 7-year-old son, 11 and 14-year-old daughters, your address, photos of your house brings home just how horrifying these threats can be. We can all agree that these attacks on election workers and their families are inexcusable, and that if we don't act, we can't expect public servants to continue to perform the essential tasks of administering our free and fair elections. As we pointed out, it isn't just in urban areas, it's in suburban areas, it's in rural areas where they may have even less access to law enforcement assistance, as you pointed out. As Mr. Masterson said in his testimony, election workers are the guardians of our democracy. It is clear, as Secretary Hobbs and others have noted, that there is a need for action. We need to protect those on the front lines of our democracy. I think that while a lot of work is done on the state basis, I'm a big believer in that, but I also think at some point as a federal government, we need to stand up, as Senator King pointed out. Congress and actually the drafters of our Constitution anticipated that the Congress would have a role in making or altering the laws of elections. And, you know, at the very least right now, what we're talking about is that it should be a federal crime to intimidate and threaten or coerce those who administer our elections in a federal election. We need to protect against interference in the counting of ballots. We need to protect local officials from arbitrary and unfounded removal. And we need to protect against the mishandling of federal election records, which puts both the personal information of voters and the security of voting systems at risk. After all, the election for president is a federal election for our entire country. And those that work in this building are in the federal system. We need to empower voters to challenge efforts in states to undermine, to make sure that they are not undermining election results and enshrine the right to have their votes counted. These provisions are included actually in the Freedom to Vote Act. And as Senator King extended the olive branch, I also invite my Republican colleagues to work with us on these common sense solutions. So I want to thank you all, coming from different parts of the country, different political views, different backgrounds, united to upholding our democracy and protecting our election officials, of course, your own families, but also those that work for you in your offices, as well as those that work across your states. So thank you very much for your good work. Our election officials, regardless of their party, were truly the heroes in this last election, and we thank you for your work. Thank you very much. The hearing is adjourned. We will keep the record open for 1 week. Thank you.